And I will begin now with Dr. Andreas Fulda, an associate professor from the Faculty of Social Sciences at Nottingham University. He is a member of the UK's Academic Freedom and Internationalisation of Higher Education Working Group and an expert on EU-China relations, citizen diplomacy and academic freedom. So we are here to hear from Andreas and looking forward to his input to the discussion. So if you'd like to begin, Andreas.
Well, thank you so much, Flo, for inviting me today. I will actually speak in a kind of double capacity, not just as an academic, but also as a practitioner. And not many of you or my colleagues will know this, but prior to joining academia in 2007, I actually worked as a practitioner in China and actually advised the Chinese government, so to speak, because I was actually what we called an integrated expert at the China Association for NGO Cooperation, which is a government-organized NGO, an umbrella organization for Chinese nonprofit organizations in the social development field and the environmental field. Now, that was still during the era of General Secretary Hu Jintao. And whilst China at that time wasn't necessarily liberal, it was actually far more open. And so during those 3 years that I spent with Kango, we actually supported Chinese NGOs in the growth and maturation process, providing capacity building. We ran environmental campaigns to reduce energy consumption. And we also engaged in collective policy entrepreneurship on behalf of vulnerable groups like migrant workers. Now, all of this good work came to a screeching halt when the Communist Party selected Xi Jinping as their successor. And in 2013, document number 9 was leaked, which showed that under Xi Jinping, we would have to expect a highly illiberal tenure. And this document number 9 turned civil society, our activity field, into a taboo topic. It declared universal values no longer welcome to speak about publicly, and also opposed independent journalism, among others. And so one of the challenges that I think we've all been facing, whether it's Chinese citizens or outsiders who take interest in current Chinese affairs, is that over the past 10 years, we have really seen how the Communist Party has started to control pretty much every sector of Chinese society and industry. And this has repercussions for the UK as well. So for example, last year, the Hong Kong National Security Law was passed. Now you could say, what does that have to do with us here in the UK? A lot, because it includes Article 38, which is extraterritorial in its application, and it effectively criminalizes what we do. In particular, if we research or teach about China in critical ways. That actually puts us as staff and students at risk. So this is something we need to, this is a risk that we need to mitigate. And to cut a long story short, we can see that the heydays of globalization are over. Whether we like it or not, we now face a period of perhaps deglobalization, the rise of authoritarian regimes, and we now have to think through the implications of such geopolitical developments. What that means in practice is that whereas in the past we thought about engaging with China in terms of win-win categories, we now have to actually think about how can we manage risks, in particular political risks. Now, what I would like to do for the remainder of my time is to briefly talk about the role of the British state, how British higher education institutions, in my view, already respond to these challenges and could respond to them even better in the future. I'll briefly talk about my experience in Nottingham, and then outline a few of the challenges both for staff and students who concern themselves with this very intricate and difficult issues. So let me briefly talk about the British state. It's quite interesting, actually. As you can hear from my ever so slight accent, I'm not a Brit myself. I'm actually from Germany originally, but I've lived and worked in the UK now for 15 years. And I noticed that the British state, unlike the United States, unlike Australia, has been surprisingly light touch so far, at least, when it comes to the regulation of the higher education sector and the issue of security-related issues. And I've been arguing for quite some time now that this is perhaps only a very short grace period granted by the government to the sector to get its house in order. Now, to be fair, the Association of British Universities, UUK, have made good use of this mandate to self-regulate, and they came up with a policy called Managing Risks in Internationalization, Security-Related Risks or Issues. And this policy came out in 2020, and British universities have been tasked to implement that UUK policy. And in a nutshell, it requires us to do to protect four things, you could say. The four protects. It sounds like a Chinese policy in that regard. The four protects means we have to protect our reputation and values, protect our people, that includes, of course, staff and students, protect our campuses, and protect our partnerships. And so these are, from a German perspective, at least, fairly progressive goals, I should say. In Germany, they don't have policies of that nature. So in that sense, the UK is actually far ahead. So that's good news. Also, now, if I may draw on the experience in Nottingham without divulging too much internal information, because I'm not authorized to do so, I was actually heartened that our senior leaders were very open when we discussed these issues internally and tried to find good ways how to implement this UUK guideline. And to my delight, in May this year, our university executive board actually accepted our recommendations in full. And moving forward, I think they will take very bold action addressing many of the issues which were raised by UUK. Now, you could say this is clearly a success story. Maybe this is also what you would expect me to say, but it's not actually going to be plain sailing moving forward. And the reason being, there are, of course, still two more constituencies, and that is staff and students. Now, among staff, I know that there are some colleagues who are a little bit apprehensive when it comes to security-related issues in national security. Many are critical, for example, of the way how Prevent was rolled out. So there's a lot of suspicion towards the government, but also perhaps a reluctance to engage with senior managers in a dialogue to engage on these thorny issues. So this is going to be interesting to see how faculty, how academic staff will engage or not engage with this new agenda, because often people may feel that this unjustly kind of scapegoats particular countries or individuals, and so there might be some apprehension from that side. Now, from the student side, of course, we have a diverse student body. We not only have home EU students, but also international students, including students from the Greater China region, mainland China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc. Now, one of the specific challenges that we have faced is how can we create a safe environment for all of our students to learn? Now, under the Hong Kong national security law, we have a problem, because if we criticize the party state or its policies, and that is, let's say, documented or recorded, then this puts us as staff at risk, but also perhaps students who have criticized the party in the classroom. Now, I don't think that for a minute that our students are all like spies, or even that anyone is spying on us. But the mere suspicion that someone may be recording or taking notes is enough to keep a lot of students quiet. And I've had international students from China coming to my office telling me in private, Dr. Fulda or maybe Andreas, they said, I would love to speak openly in class, in the seminars, but I'm afraid to speak. And so this is a challenge that we have to face as a sector, as universities. And so far, I think the stopgap measure has been what we called content notices for modules. I don't think that is a solution, because we have many, let's say, departments. And so even if, let's say, we do it for politics or sociology, we still have to think of law and maybe engineering, because people could speak critically about China in any discipline. And I want to perhaps end on a positive note. The British Association for Chinese Studies commissioned a report by the very excellent Dr. Samantha Hoffman, and she came up with very practical and enforceable policy recommendations how, for example, we could deal with this issue that I just outlined. And she suggested that actually if an international student enrolls in a British university, he or she should be able to conduct his or her research free from fear or favor. And so it should be very clear from the get-go that, of course, our international students have the freedom of speech, have the freedom of expression, and academic freedom. And of course, that also applies to us as lecturers. And so I try to just use my 10 minutes to highlight how difficult it is to engage on these issues. And I'm very sorry that I've already overrun by 1 minute. So I set, I think, a bad example for the subsequent speakers, and I hope that they will learn from my mistake. Just kidding. All right, but that was my input. And yeah, I hope we will have a good meeting today.
Thank you so much, Andreas. That was really all very interesting, and I'm sure we'll return to lots of it later on. So next up, we have Jaya Pathak. She is a co-director of Yet Again, which aims to bring attention to and campaign against modern day atrocities. And she is also the co-chair of Students for Uyghurs and heavily involved with the UK Stop Uyghur Genocide campaign. We look forward to Jaya's talk today, where she'll be giving us some background on the Uyghur genocide, also talking about some points relevant to Tsinghua collaboration, but also more generally touching on the levels of complicity of Chinese institutions and officials in the genocide. So over to you, Jaya.
Thank you, Flo, and thank you, Andreas. It's honestly an honor to be with all of you, because I think all of your insights are incredible. And this really is an important topic. I'm also a university student. I'm in my master's year of my pharmacy degree. And I have experienced firsthand the issues when it comes to freedom of speech when working on topics related to the Chinese government. So as Flo said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Uyghur genocide, who the Uyghurs are. The Uyghurs are a Turkic-speaking ethnic minority. They are the indigenous inhabitants to what is now called Xinjiang in northwest China. They, as well as other Turkic Muslim groups in China, have been subject to increasing persecution, now amounting to genocide over the past decades. Held in internment camps, Uyghurs are subject to the most atrocious and horrific abuses. This includes increasing surveillance and increasing monitoring, the destruction of Uyghur cultural and religious sites, including language, literature, and poetry, criminalization of Uyghur religious practices, the expansion of these internment camps and other detention facilities, forced labor, forced abortion, forced sterilization of Uyghur women of childbearing age, widespread rape and sexual abuse, and the forced separation of Uyghur children from their parents. So why is the persecution of the Uyghurs being labeled as a genocide? Under the International Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, otherwise known as the Genocide Convention, the definition of genocide is very tight. The word genocide is not used lightly in this context, but rather in light of credible evidence and credible facts. The People's Republic of China are in breach of the Genocide Convention, of which they are a signatory to, and they bear state responsibility for committing genocide against the Uyghurs. Again, this is based on credible evidence and the application of international law to the evidence of facts. Parliaments across the world, including our own in the UK, in Canada, and the United States, have declared that the persecution of the Uyghurs constitutes genocide. And there are a few fantastic legal reports which I want to point you to, and I'll try and put the links in the chat. The first being the New Lines Institute report, which found that the People's Republic of China breached each act under Article 2 of the Convention. I'm not going to go into detail about all of the acts, but again, you can refer to this in the New Lines report, or if you have any questions after. The second report is the Essex Court Chambers report, which I'll try and find the link to. However, they were sanctioned by the Chinese government. So they did take their report down initially, but I think we saved a copy of their report for situations like this. And the third place that you can go to for a fantastic collection of evidence is the Uyghur Tribunal. This took place in summer this year in autumn. We were heavily involved in working with the outreach and trying to get people to go to the tribunal, hear all of this evidence. To have all of this in one setting is incredible. It's really rare. So I really urge you to have a look at that, and I'll put the link in the description. The judgment of the tribunal will be delivered on December the 9th this year. So that's something to also keep an eye out for. Now I'm going to discuss a little bit about the general complicity in the genocide at UK universities and in higher education, and some of the issues to do with freedom of academic freedom, but also freedom of speech. Now, to begin with, this is not news to us. Many higher education institutions in the UK are heavily involved with and have links to the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese state. This has led to a range of issues, some of which Andreas has pointed to, but I'm just going to give you a little brief summary of some of the examples of these links and some of the issues with them as well. The first I'm going to refer to is Jesus College of the University of Cambridge. Jesus College is home to a China Centre. Now, the director of the China Centre, Professor Peter Nolan, earlier this year, when the college hosted a discussion on the Uyghur genocide, urged his students to not engage and to be careful because both views should be represented, in his words, both views should be represented at this discussion, and also such discussions of genocide or whether this is genocide are not helpful. In addition to this, the college accepted a £155,000 research grant last year from the Chinese company Huawei. Now, Huawei filed patent technology that can be used to identify Uyghurs as surveillance, and the college also accepted £200,000 directly from the Chinese state. The next thing that I want to focus on is Chinese Student Scholar Associations and Confucius Institutes. Chinese Student Scholar Associations are claimed to be non-political organizations that are linked to universities to provide a home for Chinese students studying abroad and for scholars. And on the surface, this seems fantastic, this seems great. The reality is CSSAs have caused many problems when it comes to freedom of speech. And I'm going to use my example as one of them. We held a talk at Durham University earlier this year to discuss the Genocide Amendment, of which I was part of the core team organising for. It was myself, Rahima Mahmood, a Uyghur activist, my co-exec director, Joe, and Luke de Pulford. So, it was a really great panel, and it was going to be really insightful for students. However, some students on the CSSA decided to lodge complaints to the embassy. Now, again, on the surface, this isn't going to go anywhere, but we did have people who wanted to attend who felt like they could no longer attend. We were also questioning whether it was going to be intimidating us and whether it would, be an issue for us, because we also faced lots of problems in the chat with students who are part of CSSAs joining the Zoom and sending, abusive comments, abusive messages. And that was just one event. This has happened before many times to other people. I believe it's University of Cambridge closed down their CSSA because of fears of links between the Chinese embassy and campus censorship. I also want to focus a little bit on the significant increase in funding from the Chinese state and collaboration with Chinese researchers in sensitive areas such as national security and telecommunications. Interestingly, our integrated review from our government this year stated that we face a big national security threat from the Chinese government. I mean, it's ironic considering how much funding we get from them and how much research goes into things like technology. Now, the issue with this is we do not have an in-depth understanding of where this research is going to. So if the Chinese state are funding research here that's contributing to technological advancements, is that research that's being found contributing to the surveillance technology that's being created? We simply do not know. In addition to that, the medical perpetration of the genocide, I've discussed forced sterilization, forced abortion, is a key component, not just of the genocide, but of the gender-based violence that women are experiencing, Uyghur women are experiencing. How much of our medical funding is contributing to that, or our research is contributing to that? Our PPE was found to be sourced from the Uyghur region, right? And I mean, we know about the slavery that's taking place, the forced labor that's taking place in the Uyghur region. I mean, that in itself should remind us of how much we don't know yet, and that's quite a scary place to be. The last point that I want to mention is discussing the threat to academic freedom, and in particular, I want to focus on the Newcastle University academic, Dr. Jo Smith-Finley. She's incredible. She was unfortunately sanctioned by the Chinese government. So at the end of the Genocide Amendment this year, we won Magnitsky sanctions on 4 Chinese government officials and 1 entity. In retaliation, the Chinese government sanctioned British MPs, academic Dr. Jo, and also Essex Court Chambers, a legal chamber. Dr. Jo Smith-Finley expressed her concern, not just at the fact that she was sanctioned, she couldn't visit China, but also the impact that this might have on other academics in the area. And Flo really kindly shared her conversation that she had with Dr. Jo with me, and I just want to read out parts of it. So Dr. Jo said that the sanction means that I have to stop doing the part of my job where I support our students to go on their year abroad in China, become fluent in Chinese, and develop skills of intercultural awareness and communication. It also means I cannot contact my oldest Chinese friends in Beijing, who I have been close to since 1988. So that in itself is showing a direct impact of the links between the Chinese government and our academic institutions on our freedom of speech and the work of Dr. Jo. She's been working in Xinjiang for almost or just over 20 years. Now, just to summarize, again, this is a very brief overview. The reality is where we are now, there is still so much we do not know. So we know that these links exist. We know that we have evidence of the impact of these links on academic freedom, on the freedom of speech. There is little to no transparency around what the research and collaboration funded by the Chinese state is used for example, surveillance, forced labor, as I mentioned with PPE, medical implications of the Uyghur genocide. And also, this is all information that we're yet to find out. So at Students for Uyghurs, we are submitting freedom of information requests, we are researching, we're investigating, and flows of, the Exeter ambassadors are a fantastic example of when this work goes well, what we can do and what we can find out. We also need to demand greater transparency and scrutiny from our academic institutions in reference to what the existing links are and what the future links may be. So that's just a very brief overview of what the current situation looks like.
Thank you so much, Jaya, for that and for providing some context on the genocide, but also some recent examples firsthand as well of the impact it's having in the UK. So now I will move on and I will present on our Students for Uyghurs investigative articles and research into Exeter's links to the Tsinghua University alongside our suggestions for reform. So first of all, I'm just going to share my screen again. Okay. So with COVID-19 last year having a huge impact, not only on our university studies, but also student activism, everything was taken online. This is why our work for Students for Uyghurs featured online petitions, events, and articles, all aimed at raising awareness and accountability of actors linked to the genocide. This clearly includes the link we uncovered at Exeter and between Exeter and Tsinghua, which I believe is institutionally links us to actors involved in the genocide. This led to 2 widely read articles being published, with posts on our social media being shared widely, saved to over 70 students' accounts, and our posts gaining hundreds of likes. This image is from one of our first article. There we go. So our first article was titled "The University of Exeter's Complicity in the Uyghur Genocide" and discussed the memorandum of understanding between Exeter's College of Social Sciences and International Studies and Tsinghua University's Institute of International and Area Studies, which was signed on April the 5th, 2018, and also the joint chair agreement signed since then. It includes collaboration in a wide range of areas, including bioscience, computer science, international relations, area studies, law, with over 20 areas being mentioned. This partnership links Exeter to the higher education institution employing Hu Angang, the academic fundamental to designing the second generation ethnic policy, which currently underpins the Chinese Communist Party's persecution of ethnic minorities in Xinjiang, as Jaya explained earlier, this is the Uyghur genocide. Hu Angang currently heads up Tsinghua University's Institute for Contemporary China Studies. To say a little more about this second generation ethnic policy, rather than voluntary assimilation of Uyghurs to the majority Han culture, such as that occurred in the 1980s, which is often referred to as the golden era of ethnic relations. In 2011 paper, Hu Angang and Hu Lianyi advocated forced assimilation of minorities to create a state race. While the party has not publicly acknowledged the influence of second generation ethnic policy, researchers believe its central principles have already been implemented. And this article explores how Exeter's partnership with Tsinghua, which staff and those closely involved have stated, aims to open up new frontiers for joint research and teaching between the UK and China, is, in my opinion, hugely problematic. Scholars such as Vanessa Frangeville from Brussels University have been warning against such collaborations, raising concerns, and I quote, "The Chinese government is using universities to build alliances that have nothing to do with education and rather much more to do with extending soft power abroad." I will note that Exeter is not alone in its links, as mentioned by Jaya as well, but this doesn't mean it's not of concern. And this led us to look into it further when we launched our second investigative article. So this one was titled, "How do we stop Exeter University selling its morals to authoritarian states?" Firstly, I just wanted to state a little bit about the methodology behind this article. Firstly, we reached out to Exeter staff and asked for interviews or comments on the previous article and Tsinghua arrangement in general. Many academics came forward with comments and advice, but it is important to note that only one felt comfortable being named in the article. And Students for Uyghurs believe this is but one signal that Exeter University must update its academic freedom agreement to better safeguard staff to criticise the institution. Secondly, with advice from John Heathershaw, who will be speaking later, and also Tina Prelick from Oxford, Students for Uyghurs launched a Freedom of Information request to the university, asking for further details and information on the Tsinghua agreement. It was successful and heavily involved the article. Aside from this, Students for Uyghurs also joined the Academic Freedom Group, the working group, where we inputted and worked alongside academics from several universities to discuss and learn more about what constitutes appropriate policies to protect academic freedom and what does not. So this is an outline of the article. So firstly, we approached this article differently from our previous one. Rather than being actively adversarial, we wanted to open a conversation and discussion on the subject and look at practical reforms to mitigate issues arising. Worryingly, when speaking to academics, most were unsurprised about Exeter's relationship with Tsinghua. Rather than a one-off, they say it was indicative of Exeter's weak due diligence, safeguarding and consulting policies. Others recounted that Exeter had been implicated in other dubious arrangements, including our previous Vice-Chancellor meeting with Gaddafi over a £75 million deal to educate Libyan officials, although it did fall through, but it hit media headlines first. After conducting many interviews and successfully receiving our Freedom of Information request, colleagues and myself cross-referenced and came up with our 3 principal concerns with the Tsinghua relationship. These can also be applied to other authoritarian higher education arrangements. So our first issue was that we think it's ethically irresponsible. Hu Angang provides the ideological foundations to the genocide, and it's too close to be circumstantial, which is agreed by many scholars on the issue. And there are several articles posted about this online as well. Some argue, and this was from Exeter as well, from, as I said, we had many conversations with staff and not all disagreed with this relationship, which I think is important to add. So some argued that Hu Angang is a rotten apple who can be avoided in the collaboration. But our Freedom of Information request revealed Exeter academics had met with him, a Exeter academic had met with him in 2016 after speaking at a conference at Tsinghua University. What I want to ask is, how would Exeter community react if we partnered with a university who employs a Holocaust denier or advocates of eugenics? Our second issue is that the institutional relationship poses risk to Exeter and its staff alike, irrespective of personal views and whether they support the link or not. And this is because it includes reputational issues. The formalised and institutional nature of the arrangement is problematic because management and academic staff who disagree and attempt to distance themselves from Hu Angang scholarship are still reputationally implicated due to the institutional ties, meaning it may lead to reputation erosion for Exeter and staff, whether they agree or not. And also potentially has some issues regarding whether Exeter will continue to be able to invite well-known and world-renowned academics who may refuse to speak and host conferences with our SSIS. The last issue is the legitimacy issues, or rather what we called in our article, selling our reputation. And later on it will be spoken about as reputation laundering. The partnership has the potential to legitimise Tsinghua and gloss over the CCP's genocidal ethnic policy. For example, Tsinghua can call itself a forward-thinking, internationally renowned university with links to some of the UK's most prestigious institutions, while simultaneously obscuring the fact it's employing an ideological architect of the genocide. This led us, again in conversation with academics, to offer up several recommended reforms. Firstly, that funding from authoritarian states who commit mass atrocity crimes should be limited, as it's not only unethical, but also, we think, embarrassing for Exeter. Secondly, informal relationships between individual scholars at both universities should be encouraged, rather than formal institutional links. For example, Exeter could still gain benefits from the energy and vitality emanating from Tsinghua Area's Studies Department through having more informal links. And this would kind of complement the concerns of anyone saying to cut links completely, because we would still be able to improve academic quality by expanding and growing the scholarship by working with academics at Tsinghua. And lastly, the University of Exeter must ensure there is more consultation with students and staff prior to relationships being formed. We must stop finding out about donations from the Sheikh of Sharjah or partnerships with Tsinghua ex ante via a plaque or expose article. And this means including reforms of Exeter's outdated 2009 Academic Freedom Agreement, and we call for it to be replaced. So just to note before I move on, is that Students for Uyghurs condemns calls to decouple totally from China, aka cutting all ties, as we see it reflective of dangerous Cold War rhetoric, which could lead to further polarization between China and the West. It also increases the likelihood of xenophobia or anti-Chinese racism, which we condemn entirely. And before continuing on with the talks, I'd just like to quickly point out some outcomes which we really welcome. So we have welcomed the increased dialogue and engagement with the Institute of Arab and Islamic faculty members, and we would continue to welcome more engagement from our College of Social Sciences and International Studies and their management on its relationship with institutions in China, such as Tsinghua, but also concerning higher education and the internationalization of it more generally. One outcome of our discussions has been a commitment from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies staff body to compose a charter that will govern their international partnerships and engagement to support important research and teaching initiatives without bringing any external interference into teaching and research activities of their community. And this is quoted from them. It was also stated that this would not only be taken by the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies, but with the college's Pro-Vice Chancellor's approval, would be taken by the whole of the College of Social Sciences and International Studies, the SSIS. So we're hoping to hear more about this later on. The Students for Uyghurs celebrate these actions, but still believe that institutional links should be cut and donations limited and more informal ties as the only appropriate type between the universities. And that's the end of my presentation there. So I'm just going to escape from this. So thank you for listening. And it seems appropriate now to hear more from Professor Gareth Stansfield, Professor of Middle East Politics and the Al-Qasimi Chair of Arab Gulf Studies, Pro-Vice Chancellor of the SSIS, and former Associate Dean of Global SSIS. He was also the former director of the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. We will also possibly hear from Professor Lili and also Sajjad, Professor Sajjad Rizvi, who is the current Institute Director. So I look forward to hearing about the further insights and positions on the Tsinghua collaboration, why management believe it avoids concerns, and perhaps more on the benefits of these relationships. So I'll now pass the floor over. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flo. And it's a pleasure to be with you all this evening. As time's pretty limited, Sajjad and Lee will probably not speak in this 10 minutes, but will be, of course, engaging in the Q&A afterwards. And particularly, as you said, Sajjad is now the director of the Institute, and Lee is the Associate Dean for Global Engagement within the overall college. Just a few words on the, I suppose, on the nature of the engagement. For those who don't know the Institute in Exeter, it's been around for 20 years or so. It's a very outward-looking institute. The nature of its subject area means that it has a lot of networks and engagement, certainly in the Middle East and North Africa. But because of its prominence in the field, it also has these links with across the globe, including into North America, into Europe, and more recently into China. So this is part of it's an international facing department or institute. And so engagement in China and with Chinese academics and with academics focusing upon the relationship of Middle East countries in particular with China and vice versa was always something that has been prominent in the Institute for some time. So what we have seen develop over certainly the last 6 or 7 years has been the organic emergence of academics engaging with Chinese partners. This started quite slowly at first, and it's picked up momentum over the years, and with a range of institutions, starting, of course, with the usual conferences, some joint publications. We started to see PhDs coming. We have visiting academics coming over as well. And one of those relationships became particularly prominent, and that was with Tsinghua, and not least because they recently decided to establish an Institute of International and Area Studies. This is I don't know how we'd class it really. In Exeter, it would be like a university institute. It's not attached to a department. It's not attached to any particular part of the university. It's almost like a special project. And as such, it's also not attached to the part of the university that Hu Angang works in. It's nothing to do with that side of things. It's focused upon, as it says, international and area studies, and part of it works on the Middle East, on North Africa. And they reached out to a range of institutions. Exeter was one of them, but also several other Russell Group institutions that have engaged with them in different parts of international studies to build collaborations and initiatives. And one of those initiatives that developed was a joint chair arrangement in international and area studies, 50% in Exeter, 50% in Beijing. And we have duly appointed to that post. That person will go backwards and forwards, convening events on both sides, linking the two institutions together in teaching and research, which we're very pleased about. Following on from that, we're looking at deeper areas of collaboration. Exeter has a very well-known, if actually underused resource right now, that focuses upon the GCC countries of the Middle East. And this is the Arab World Documentation Unit. It's a collection of official publications from the states of the GCC. And we have entered into a collaboration with the Institute in Tsinghua, and they will bring their larger sized resource to the table in a co-funded project to build a digital archive of the Middle East. Now, we think this is a really important development within our field of area studies and in making resources accessible to not only to these two institutions, but actually broader than that. We engaged with Tsinghua to ensure that the access to the digital archive will be under the open access rubric, which we were really pleased to see happen as well. So all of that is in place. The project hasn't started yet. The final signatures haven't taken place, but we expect to see that roll out over the remainder of the academic year. In terms of what has happened in the Institute since then, we have continued with our activities on the study of the Middle East and North Africa, but also our focus upon Islamic studies as well. And of course, there is a very significant population of Muslims in China, and the Uyghurs are part of that population, and there are other ethnicities that are also Muslim in China as well. We have hosted events within the Institute that have focused on the situation in Xinjiang. We hosted Sean Roberts from George Washington University, who wrote a very critical book of the situation in Xinjiang. And Sajjad himself has also hosted a seminar on Islam in China. There has been no pressure, no comment, no anything from Tsinghua or Chinese representatives. Indeed, we actually had, I think, and Sajjad will correct me if I'm wrong, I think we had some Chinese participants from China in some of those events. And we'll continue with that sort of activity. We are very careful within the Institute, whether it's in this relationship or with other external partners, that we do not have strings attached. And if we do, we will walk away from those relationships. And that is the same with our partnerships that we have with donors and benefactors in the Arab Gulf as well. I think on that point, I'm not quite sure, I haven't had a red flag from John yet, but I think I've said what I think I need to say right now about the Institute's relationship and partnership. As for the college, yes, as you quite rightly said, Flo, the Institute has committed to looking at how it engages internationally, and Sajjad is taking that work forward as the director. Now I'm the Pro-Vice Chancellor of the college. We are taking this on as well within the framework of the university's review of its engagement in this area too. So it's certainly not something that we're ignoring and will walk away from. It's very important for us to get this right, for us to be transparent, and for us to be able to engage in partnerships that are rewarding for teaching and research and are acceptable to our wider community. So thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. And I'm sure people will have more questions on that later on, but thank you for giving us more information on that. So keeping the flow going, we will now move on to hear from Professor Mark Goodwin, Exeter's Deputy Vice Chancellor of Global Engagement. He is responsible for the delivery of the university's global strategy and has oversight of all the university's global activities, including international student recruitment and global partnerships. From Mark, we will hear more about his work and the university's position and procedures in place for navigating the relationships with higher education institutions within authoritarian regimes. Thanks, Mark. If you want to unmute yourself, and you can begin.
Thanks very much, Flo, and thanks for that introduction, and thanks also for inviting me to speak at this event. It's a real pleasure to be here and engage in this dialogue, as you said at the beginning. Let me start by saying that the University of Exeter is proud to be a global institution. It's ranked in the top 150 in the world by both QS and Times Higher league tables. And we collaborate with other universities right across the world. We recruit students from over 150 countries. We recruit staff from across the world. And we all gain from being part of this inclusive and diverse community. And I think global collaboration between universities has never been more important than it is now. Although the word unprecedented has become somewhat overused, the global challenges that we're facing now, I think, are truly unprecedented. They range from preventing catastrophic climate and environment change, which we've never had to cope with at this scale before, to dealing with a global pandemic, which we've not had to cope with at this scale before. And these can't be solved by countries working in isolation. They require collaboration, including collaboration between the world's top universities. And this became really clear to me, and in fact more clear than ever, when I recently had the good fortune to attend the COP26 climate summit in Glasgow. I went as part of a team of around 50 staff and students from the University of Exeter. And we joined thousands of people from all over the world with a common interest in addressing the threat of climate change and ensuring a greener and more resilient future, whatever the political differences between those people. And John Kerry, when talking about a new agreement between the US and China, he's the US climate envoy, said that there are no shortages of differences, but on climate, cooperation is the only way to get this job done. And in this regard, it's important to reference Dr. Jean-Francois Mercure, who's one of our academics in the geography department. He coordinates a £4.8 million 3-year research project on transforming energy systems, funded by the UK government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation. This project includes Oxford, Cambridge and UCL in the UK, but it has 16 partners worldwide from Brazil, India, the EU and China. And this is a reason for me mentioning it here, because the China partner includes Tsinghua. This is a phenomenal research project, as I say, funded by the UK government to look at the transition in energy systems across several different countries. And a copy of that research was put in all of the world leaders' packs at COP. An extraordinary positive collaboration between Exeter and Tsinghua, not just Exeter and Tsinghua, but a whole range of institutions and universities across the globe. The other reason for me pointing that out is it shows the way that absolutely world-class academic research is now done. It's done in collaboration with other researchers from across the globe. And we work with many partner universities on a whole variety of topics, many of them focusing on the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And well over half of our publications, and the same will be true at Nottingham for Andreas, well over half of our publications now have international co-authors. And we know that international research, which is co-authored, has a wider reach, it gets to more people, it has more impact. And what this means is that our academic staff want to work with the best researchers across the world. And indeed, this is what's driven our international collaborations. You asked, how do we choose them, Flo? We essentially choose them on the basis of what our academics are telling us they're doing and who they're working with. So Gareth has just explained how the partnership with Tsinghua was an organic one. It came over several years of academics working together. We recently also signed an agreement with the University of Queensland in Australia. We did that because when we looked at the publication data, we found that academics from the two institutions had written over 200 articles together in the previous 5 years. So we tend to be led by our academics in terms of who they want to work with and who they want us to work with. But before entering into any new collaboration, the university employs robust due diligence and approval processes. It ensures that it's following the most up-to-date regulations and guidance from the UK government and from the university's UK. Richard will say a bit more about this in a minute, but we are implementing the recommendations set out in the recent UUKI report, but I won't preempt what he's got to say. Just turning to China, UK government advice has been that we should continue our connections as part of the UK's extensive links in both teaching and research. And in terms of research, a recent report by Joe Johnson, a former universities minister, working with the Policy Institute at King's College, London, showed that collaborations between China and the UK have increased massively. There were fewer than 100 co-authored papers before 1990. There were about 750 a year in 2000. And in 2019, there were 16,267 joint publications, 16,267. Over 10% of the entire UK's academic publications were co-authored with China. And in some subjects, over 30%, a third, of every single academic paper is now co-authored with an academic from China. And it's clear that research relationships between the UK and China is absolutely critical for the future of UK science as China overtakes the US in its research and development expenditure. So collaboration and flow of researchers and students will be required for the UK to maintain a leading position, as the UK government put it only yesterday in its response to the Foreign Affairs Committee's report into Xinjiang province. International research collaboration is central to both our position as a science superpower, and our research sector therefore needs to be both open as well as secure. And it's the both open and secure that needs to be emphasized here. So at the same time, universities need to balance collaboration with the mitigation of risks, and we need to ensure that we uphold the core values of the academy that Gareth spoke about. And this is one of the reasons that we are setting up a task and finish group to review our current agreement on academic freedom. That's a joint agreement with our trade union. And the group will be a committee of the University Senate. It will have representation from Senate, the trade union, and a wider university membership. And it will undertake that review between now and June 2022. And it will enable a new joint agreement that Flo was calling for on academic freedom to be implemented for the 22-23 academic year. So we're really pleased to be doing that. Moving on to our specific collaboration with Tsinghua, we've had a partnership since 2011. Again, as Gareth said, that's grown gradually. Tsinghua now ranked the #1 institution in China, number 17 in the world. We've developed around 40 different research collaborations in the last decade across a very wide range of areas. But as Gareth said, we have never and will never collaborate with Hu Angang, and we have never and will never work with Tsinghua researchers on questions of ethnicity, whether that's ethnicity in Xinjiang, in China, or elsewhere. We've never done that, and we would not do that. As indicated earlier, one of the main areas of focus is climate change, and I talked a little bit about that. We also work on environment and human health, and our academics were commissioned to edit a special edition of The Lancet on the theme of climate change and health, which has been translated into Chinese. We also collaborate through our psychology researchers on traumatic brain injury, the biggest cause of death and disability worldwide in young children and young adults of working age. We work with Tsinghua to determine possible safety measures and intervention strategies to prevent brain injury in children. There are collaborations between our bioscientists, between our engineers, developing renewable technologies to tackle climate change, between our computer scientists and between many other academic staff. But our collaborations also enable exchanges of students, which is really important. We need students to understand each other. We need to collaborate with students across the globe. We need to open students up to intercultural experiences, not to close them down. And Exeter's humanities scholars are working with their counterparts in Tsinghua's Institute for World Literature and Culture as part of the UK-China Humanities Alliance, which involves several other universities in China and several other universities in this country, including Oxford, Cambridge, SOAS, King's, London, etc., etc. And the Alliance promotes cross-cultural, transnational and global dialogues and conversations in the humanities and across humanities education. And our students have come together to have 2 conferences in the last couple of years on the themes of their PhDs and the themes of their choosing and their selection. So we feel it's really important to open up students to views of others across the world, because that can only help us understand each other. So I'd just like to finish by looking to the future. Partnerships will remain at the heart of what we do here at the university, because this is an era of global higher education. We've just launched our ambitious new 10-year strategy, and 2 elements of that strategy are our partnerships and our place in the world. So it will be imperative that we continue to work with partners across the globe to continue to grow our research, to address those massive transnational challenges, and to give our students the best possible chance of experiencing other cultures and understanding those cultures. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you for all of those points and also talking a bit more about the future. And it is good to hear about the Academic Freedom Agreement, which is going to be renewed for the academic year of 2022 to 23. So thank you for that. And I'm sure there'll be questions on this later. So also attending this meeting, we have Richard Foord, who Mark alluded to earlier. He's Exeter's acting head of global partnerships, and he is willing to tell us more about the current guidelines in place for partnerships with higher education institutions inside authoritarian states and how Exeter is implementing them. So if you'd like to start, Richard.
Thank you, Flo. Australian former Prime Minister Paul Keating referred last week to Britain as being like an old theme park sliding into the Atlantic compared to modern China. Thankfully, the UK's world-class research base is far from being a spectacle, and it continues to benefit from having Chinese visitors working in our labs and in our lecture theatres. Andreas said in his 11-minute introduction earlier that the university's UK guidelines in 2020 were sort of a framework for thinking about risks in internationalisation. And former Education Minister Joe Johnson has pointed out that those UK guidelines don't once mention China by name, and perhaps they should, but they do contain some useful guidance. Here's some guidance from those guidelines. There are threats to the values that have underpinned the success of the UK higher education sector: academic freedom, freedom of speech, and institutional autonomy. These values are rooted in the UK's commitment to democracy and to the rule of law. UK universities should make sure that partners are aware of our institution's commitment to academic freedom and freedom of speech and the implications for working in collaboration. We should develop and promote clear codes of conduct, policies, and legal agreements that enshrine core values, including academic freedom. And partner organisations or individuals may seek to access or influence particular areas of activity through various forms of funding arrangements and other inducements targeted at individuals. So we'll think a little bit about how this has applied at Exeter. These UK guidelines were considered by the Vice-Chancellor's Executive Group in November 2020, and the University of Exeter adopted those guidelines. In particular, the Vice-Chancellor's Executive Group decided that a governing body of the institution, the University Council, would receive an annual report on security-related risks faced by the institution and how those risks are being managed. The Vice-Chancellor's Executive Group also adopted a recommendation that there should be a review of our current processes around the approval of research and education partnerships. Mark Goodwin convened over the summer this year a task and finish group to consider Exeter's partnership approval process. We looked into the question of whether the approval process could be streamlined, and we concluded that with all this additional due diligence required with some partnerships, we can't really streamline our decision-making processes significantly. Actually, we intend to appoint to a new partnerships and compliance manager role early in 2022 to support the additional due diligence that we've recognised is required with some partnerships. Approvals for university level partnerships are still required at Exeter by both global and research executive committees. I've heard it said before that approval processes in universities are becoming increasingly sequestered, such that one part of the university doesn't necessarily have visibility of what's going on in the international space. At Exeter, we have a global executive committee which reviews proposed partnerships, and that has a broad-based membership, including college pro-vice chancellors. In the case of the Tsinghua partnership, the global committee reviewed the proposed partnership as well as the vice-chancellor's executive group. Students and staff of the university will be able to have a look online at the University of Exeter's due diligence policy. Additional scrutiny was applied for the Tsinghua partnership in particular. BCG considered the Exeter-Tsinghua relationship in February 2021, and that was because the sum of money involved is greater than £250,000. And in such instances, those partnerships need to be referred to the Vice-Chancellor's Executive Group. That group is required to make a decision on, and there will be one of three outcomes. Either the project or relationship will be suspended pending further investigation. The project or relationship will be approved or it won't be approved. And in this particular case, the relationship was approved by the Vice-Chancellor's executive group. And at that meeting, it was minuted that China's treatment of ethnic groups was raised, and it was confirmed that neither the Middle East Archive collection nor the institution have direct links. The archive was confirmed as a collection that focuses on the states of the Gulf area, and it is a historic collection that hasn't been used or updated in a decade, so that digitizing makes this a good resource that will enable further work with partners. On the subject of academic freedom, I heard a Chinese studies scholar use a proverb: when you take food from someone, your tongue becomes shorter. Given that partnerships with researchers in institutions in other countries involves a bit of give and take, we do need to remain alert that Exeter academics do not self-censor. Senior Exeter academics have exercised this academic freedom in workshops just in the last year, referring, when having a workshop with China, to China and Hong Kong, recognizing the status of the special administrative region under the one country, two systems setup. Jaya helpfully set out earlier the sanctions that the Chinese state has imposed on Dr. Jo Smith-Finlay at Newcastle University. The University of Exeter supports Dr. Jo Smith-Finlay in relation to her freedom to write on ethnic minorities in the northwest of China. The university shares the UK position. The UK universities have both a legal duty and a moral imperative to promote and support academic freedom, which is a fundamental feature of research and a shared value that underpins international cooperation. We and all of our institutions and universities UK fully support and reaffirm the rights of our academic community to support and to pursue their work free from the threat of sanction by any government. There are academics who take issue with the term academic freedom, or at least maybe don't have a common understanding of it. Dr. Xin Xu from the Department of Education at Oxford says, the issue of academic freedom and university autonomy will always be on the agenda when discussing about Chinese research, and this has been complicated by rising policy rhetoric around national security in major Western countries. One problem is the historical roots, understandings, and manifestation of academic freedom, which can vary across contexts. And here the Chinese case may be more complex and maybe not easily benchmarked to the Western standard. Personally, I prefer the perspective of a University of Exeter academic, Exeter's own Dr. Kat Owen. She writes that in advancing the internationalization agenda in non-liberal environments, UK-based scholars may find themselves caught between a rock and a hard place, either legitimizing and sustaining the subjection of knowledge production to the state, on the one hand, or engaging in a form of epistemological colonialism by demanding adherence to our values, on the other. The university's own investigations in 2015 and 2016 revealed that a Chinese academic employed by the University of Exeter said they'd met Hu Angang at a conference in China. No one from Exeter has collaborated with Hu Angang or Hu Lianhe, and we worked hard to ascertain that is the case. The Exeter academic who had met Hu Angang at a conference warned that the situation of having the institution investigating that person's China links could lead to McCarthyism, a sort of witch hunt targeting Chinese scholars or scholars with connections to Chinese institutions. And of course, we want to avoid such a witch hunt. Finally, I just want to leave you with sort of an example of some positive research that is going on at Tsinghua. Professor Zhang Shiliang of Tsinghua University was credited by the UK website Carbon Brief last month with making carbon reduction targets in China more ambitious ahead of COP26. The University of Exeter is home to the UK's 5 most influential climate scientists, and our collaboration with Tsinghua enables some of the most renowned climate scientists in the world in the UK and China to work together to help tackle the environment and climate emergency. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that, Richard, and giving us more details on how Exeter's inputting and implementing the policies as the recommended research is currently guiding us. We're heading towards the end of the presentations now, but next we have Ms. Aleksandra Stankova, Project Manager of the Academic Freedom and Internationalization Working Group, who has agreed to speak about the recent research on reputation laundering and academic freedom issues within the UK higher education sector, alongside the current focus and advocacy efforts of the Academic Freedom Internationalisation Working Group. So if you'd like to speak, Alex.
Thank you very much for the invite, Flo, and for the opportunity to have this very timely discussion. It's great to see some familiar faces as well from our meetings with Exeter University students and staff in the summer, where we had the opportunity to discuss some of the Students for Uyghurs campaign developments and also brainstorm ideas about how to continue this conversation about protecting academic freedom. So I'm pleased to be able to continue doing that at the event. And I'm briefly going to be speaking up from the perspective of coordinating the advocacy efforts of the Academic Freedom and Internationalization Working Group for the AIFWG in the last year. And I'll also summarize findings from research carried out by AIFWG members and their colleagues this year with the National Endowment for Democracy on reputation laundering in UK and US university sectors, which might be of interest to you and which has also informed the AIFWG's focus and efforts. So very briefly, the AIFWG is an independent initiative which brings together a growing number of academics from several UK higher education institutions, as well as civil society representatives and the all-party parliamentary human rights group, who share a common concern for the protection of academic freedom and the academic community in the context of rapid and increased internationalization of UK higher education. And one of our main goals throughout has been to hold wide consultations with key higher education practitioners, with academics, students, and policy experts to inform the revision of the draft model code of conduct, a document first put together last year as a best practice resource for higher education institutions in the UK, which introduces transparency and accountability measures for universities to adopt, and also bolsters university autonomy and self-initiative in this way. So crucially, it also aims to start a wider dialogue on how to approach internationalization and protect academic freedom at the same time. A dialogue which the AIFWG members believe this should include a broader forum: students, staff, researchers, and scholars who are working on these issues, university management, and higher education practitioners, as issues of authoritarian influencing, reputation laundering, censorship and self-censorship, safety of students and researchers working in politically sensitive context and on politically sensitive topics, university autonomy, the integrity of the higher education sector really are issues which concern and impact everyone. Therefore, the importance of independent initiatives and an open and honest platform to discuss those issues is enormous. I'm very pleased to see the efforts of Students for Uyghurs as well. So, as a general overview, in the last 20 years, new partnerships with academic institutions, companies, and governments have led to a significant increase in foreign funding and a near tripling of philanthropic donations received by UK and Irish universities, so from 0.5 billion to 1.3 billion. And while the majority of gifts come from UK and US donors over the late 2000s, sources have gradually shifted to the East, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And there are some estimates that by 2020, more than a third of overseas funding will be coming from China. This has also been accompanied by a change in the composition of fundraising as well, as more and more universities in the UK have received and solicited larger donations from a smaller number of elite donors, which presents particular challenges for academic freedom. So it goes without saying that in the absence of thorough university governance or oversight, this may also create pathways for donors to exert direct influence over an institution's publicly stated purpose, the research agenda, or profile. And as Flo has spoken about this as well, an ongoing concern is that even where there is a greater care and due diligence to scrutinize the origins of the funds, donors and patrons might still use universities as a legitimizing forum for public speeches and lectures. And in this way, they blur the lines between authoritarian influencing and commercial interests. In short, reputation laundering. That also can discredit corruption and allegations back in their home country. And thirdly, gifts from foreign sources were sanctioned or politically exposed or have histories of corrupt business practices might also, of course, entangle universities in legal violations and disputes which damage the reputational standing of an institution. An oft-cited example of this, which led to some changes in donation review processes of UK higher education institutions, was the gift of 1.5 million by Saif Gaddafi pounds who is the son to the then Libyan President Muammar Gaddafi in 2010, to the Global Governance Center of the LSE through a foundation controlled by Saif's father. So the LSE investigation into the incident which is now known as the Wolf Report, revealed that the LSE had conducted minimum due diligence concerning the donation. And that Saif Gaddafi, who in 2008 was also awarded a doctoral degree in philosophy from the university, may have plagiarized his LSE thesis. And that case was really a catalyst for the expansion of review procedures and reputation damage management in the higher education sector, but also exposed the sector to increased and intense media scrutiny over donations. So over time, more and more cases emerge after light is shown on similar cases, whether that's by the diligent work of researchers or students or staff concerned with academic freedom. And this has really underscored the need for action and for greater transparency and accountability measures surrounding these issues. So in the UK, there are no systematic data outlining the country of origin of donations, and there is currently no standard procedure or institutional configuration for conducting due diligence. And the recent research on reputation laundering in the university sector, which was carried out by Professor John Heathershaw and Dr. Tena Prelec and their colleagues Alex Cooley and Thomas Main from the NED, suggests that the current ethical guidelines and oversight procedures of UK universities are not sufficiently transparent. So they conducted a survey of the US top 20 and the 24 UK Russell Group universities, as well as conducted 13 interviews with the gift assessment officers of these universities and analyzed publicly available examples of cases. And they found that only 7 out of 17 Russell Group universities which were assessed have independent gift committees and published guidance they use to assess donations. So instead, senior leaders and managers approve donations. Some universities also have an ad hoc system of senior management approval guidelines, which are only available internally, which is the case for Exeter as well. Therefore, scrutiny procedures for these partnerships differ greatly among institutions. Determining whether funds have illicit origins often is not very straightforward. Money is often laundered so that the precise source can be obscured. Individuals which are close to kleptocrats or ethically compromised actors often claim to be independent, and also reliable data and good investigative journalism and research may be scarce. So in addition, the length of the vetting processes also may vary widely between institution and institution. So larger universities may conduct screenings twice, once at the beginning of the donor relationship and again when the gift is formally put forward. But they often find themselves at a disadvantage to secure information, accurate information, timely information about the donor's history and business practices. So a lot depends on the amount of resources and expertise that an individual institution can put together. And there is little agreement within universities as to what exactly constitutes reputational risk and how to mitigate against it or recognize the red flags. Some universities, for example, have developed heat maps based on external indicators, such as Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, while others operate on a purely case-by-case basis using open source data and even information that is just available in the public domain, media news, and so on and so forth. So regardless of the university size and the reputational clout, really lack of transparency and uniform institutional procedures can still expose institutions to academic freedom threats arising from improperly vetted donations and lack of public oversight. And the report recommends the creation of a comprehensive and searchable public list of all donations foreign and domestic, over a threshold of £10,000, including the identity of the donor, the amount, and the major stipulations, and also suggests that higher education institutions should consider making their gift acceptance policy and ethical guidelines and core principles for accepting donations and forming partnerships publicly available. So the IIFWG has also engaged very seriously with these issues of international partnerships and gifts and donation, because the members consider it an academic freedom issue among other issues. And this is all outlined in the draft model code of conduct, which, as I mentioned, has been going extensive consultations. So I think I'll just finish here and pass over to John, who can perhaps give us an overview of the code of conduct and discuss some of its proposed measures, which might be more relevant to Exeter University.
Thank you very much, Alex. That was really informative. And as you said, John, if you want to fill us in more on that, and perhaps also how you think it's relevant to Exeter.
Sure, thank you, Flo. And I'm going to speak largely in my capacity as a member of the National Academic Freedom and Internationalization Working Group, just as Andreas is. I will say some things, first of all, maybe about an Exeter context for me. I work in Central Asian Studies, and that includes the Uyghurs and Xinjiang. That's the historic area of Eastern Turkestan. My work's largely on Western Turkestan. I think from a Tsinghua perspective in this partnership, there was an interest in the former Soviet Union. I myself was involved in some discussions early on. I came to the judgment that it would be impossible really for me to maintain involved in, or to gain an involvement in this partnership and maintain my academic freedom. And the reason I felt that was because I'm a close colleague and friend of Joseph Finley, who's already been mentioned. We were hosting a conference in 2019, the European Society of Central Asian Studies, where one of the things we were doing was speaking out on behalf of the dozens of Uyghur scholars that had been interned, incarcerated, or disappeared in Xinjiang. It was impossible for me as a Central Asian Studies academic to consider how, with a university directly subordinate to the Communist Party of China, a free and open discourse on these issues would be possible. Had I sought to maintain and balance a fine line, sought to maintain my academic freedom to some degree to speak out on these issues, my fear, and this is not an abstract fear at all because I've seen this in other authoritarian contexts, would be that I would put others at risk, those that I work with. So for me, that it was not possible really to continue. And I think that demonstrates some of the limits perhaps of internationalization when it rubs up against academic freedom. But it may well be the case that the partnership has enormous benefits, and that certainly seems to be the case. And there are many, many areas in which working with China is really, really important. So I'm not going to object on those levels. That's not the position I'm taking. And I think that's true of many people here. What I will do, however, is just share some slides very briefly right now, which put the focus in a different direction, and that is that of accountability, or rather transparency and accountability. So I think it's reasonable to say that accountability requires transparency. Processes which are effective at assessing the ethics and the whys and wherefores and academic freedom issues associated with international partnerships are great, but they're always going to be limited if they're not fully transparent. Here we have a Times headline from the 12th of October 2020, when the Academic Freedom and Internationalization Working Group launched its model code of conduct to ask universities to be far more transparent about what they were doing, so that staff and students could have confidence that the processes were one which were driven not simply by what academics may want to do in a given context, actually, or by market requirements, but by a set of standards, a set of common standards which universities hold themselves to. So transparency, I think we will get that through one way or another. We can get that through university headlines, many stories about universities which embarrass institutions very often based on the kind of freedom of information requests that Flo and colleagues were able to do to gain more information about Exeter's partnerships. they can emerge through events like this, and this is a fantastic one, the kind of thing we would really encourage as a group that campuses should be having about partnerships such as this one, but they shouldn't be happening in response to the issue being forced. They should be happening on a more systematic basis. They should be happening through annual meetings perhaps, and through a level of transparency that allows us to know, without doing freedom of information requests, know about the kind of international partnerships in our institutions. So it's very odd at the end. I've been putting comments in the chat to try and get people moving. We're nearly an hour and a half in. I'm just offering you some definitions here right at the end. What do we mean when we talk about academic freedom? Just take a look at those things there on the left. Teach, of course, engage in academic thinking, carry out research. But there are other elements to this too, the ability to criticize the system in which one works, to participate in academic bodies, to not be censored, to fulfill functions without discrimination or fear of repression. Now, I hold those values dear, and I think they're absolutely crucial, as I think almost maybe everyone here would recognize that these are absolute values and are important for the academy. They are not achieved quite clearly, as we've heard from Andreas's talk and others, in China, and that does give us these problems in the cooperation. That's the fundamental issue which transpires here. So we then can have what's called in the literature transnational repression of academics and students, often hidden, but it is possible to do research on it. It's something that I and colleagues have been doing research on for some time. And also at the state level, authoritarian influencing. Again, very, very difficult to perceive, but which subtly and formally can shape the agendas which are taking place. So what is the answer to all of this? Well, to shine some light on it. Democratization, if you like, bringing staff and students back into the conversation. So it's great that the University Council is on top of this, and it's great that Mark and Gareth and colleagues are reporting to them, but it can't be enough simply to report to university councils. The Draft Model Code of Conduct of the Academic Freedom and Internationalization Working Group suggests that a common set of standards are developed by staff and students. So this is a model framework, but what we want is engagement on campuses to help develop what are the appropriate standards for that institution. Really important to this conversation, I think, meaningful consultation prior to the adoption of any new major international partnerships where a risk to academic freedom is present. And a system of reporting, investigating to a designated person where academic freedom is being violated in cases. Confidential reporting that staff and students can be sure about. Training and support to staff to help them safeguard their academic freedom. And I think really, really importantly, transparency, which is published and substantially discussed in an annual report. That might be on donors and donations. UK universities will routinely say we can't publish donations because we enter into non-disclosure agreements. Well, they do it in the United States, and it has been a legal requirement there since the late 1980s. Agreements on transnational research and education, at least summary of information of that should be put into the public square. And reporting also where we've had anonymized reports, which would be anonymized, of confirmed violations of academic freedom. And that is how accountability then comes in. Through this transparency, we know about this, we're able to discuss it, and we are able then collectively as an institution, staff and students, to make decisions, to have informed debates on what kinds of international partnerships we should be entering into, and to be sure and confident that academic freedom for staff and students is being maintained. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much, John, for that presentation. We now have half an hour where we are going to open up to broader discussion with people wanting, please do start putting questions into the chat or use the raising your hand function if you want to ask a question. Before we do this, I'm just going to end the recording so you can get as many people coming forward as possible.